Two more pages. Top of page 462. The Eucharistic Christ, then, is simultaneously the way this transformation works. It is both the way and, in the end, what all will become. While the Eucharist is Christ present both within and without man, this presence does not constitute any eternal union or oneness with Christ. The Eucharistic Christ is the means by which God first effects an abiding oneness with man's own human nature, and thereafter begins the transformation into God's own incarnate human nature. Needless to say, this transformation will entail a radical change in human nature itself, but then, man was created to become more than he is now. This becoming more is a transformative process that has no quick fixes. This is not the place to go into this process. We are only pointing out how the Eucharist works to make this a reality. We could even say this is what the Eucharist is all about and why God made it so. One way or another, it seems, God is determined to be all in all. So in the end, then, it is not we, some person or other, who become Christ. Rather, it is solely man's common human nature, transformed into God's own incarnate human nature. This oneness of natures being Christ. While Christ is the image of God in man, the Eucharist, however, is no image, but the reality itself. Once transformed into this reality, there is no image of Christ, there is solely its reality. The Eucharist, then, is the revelation of man's end, the definitive end of his human journey. The Incarnation is but the beginning. After all, there can be no end before man has lived the human experience. Had God revealed the Eucharistic Christ at the beginning, no one could possibly have understood it. Witness all the disciples that left Jesus over this Eucharistic issue. Marginalia, John chapter 6, I think. And not only these disciples, but much of Christianity debunks the bread and wine as mere symbol, a kind of ritualistic remembrance. Somehow their Christian faith never included the truth God reveals in the Eucharistic Christ. The Eucharist is actually the final estate of Christ's glorified, transformed human nature in its eternal oneness with and in God. So too, the Eucharistic Christ is the end estate for every human being. One Christ, one eternal human nature, one with God in the Trinity. So the Eucharist is not only the pinnacle or means of transformation, but the end itself. Not only the Alpha and Omega, but the way between. While in his earthly life Jesus pointed the way to God, now, however, in the heavenly Christ, that is the way. It is the heavenly Christ that is the way. The Eucharist imparts a knowledge of Christ quite apart from anything said or found in the Gospels. While the Bible only recounts 3 years of Jesus' public life, the Eucharist is the living Christ with us now, and not the historical man who lived 2,000 years ago. One of the early popes remarked that we are more fortunate today than in Jesus' historical lifetime because then only a few people knew Christ, whereas now in the Eucharist, Christ can be known by everyone. While the Eucharist seems utterly other than what man is now, yet it is the same human nature, only not the human nature man knows now. Nothing we know of man's nature on this earth is recognizable in the Eucharist because no one knows the essence of man that God united to itself. But whatever its essence, we know the Eucharist as man's ultimate essence united eternally to the essence of God. The mystery of the Eucharistic Christ is not only the true nature of man's oneness with God, but the mystery of man's final heavenly estate. In truth, the mystery of Christ is bound up in the Eucharist, and so too the mystery of man's final oneness with God. While the cross is the fitting icon of man committing his very existence to God, the Eucharist is the icon of the glorified personless Christ, man's final oneness with God. The Eucharist is not only Christ's promise to be with man always, but the fulfillment of the whole purpose of the Incarnation, that all may be eternally one with and in God. As one of the Fathers put it, quote, "We shall pass from the grace of faith to the grace of vision, when Christ will indeed transform us into himself," end quote. A personal note, which she does not mention in her autobiography, so a little bonus track here. Preparing for First Holy Communion, age 6 or 7, I would always recall a priest telling us, quote, "The host only becomes Christ after you consume it," end quote. I do not recall the context, but his words stuck. Since we had been taught the Eucharist was already Christ, what did he mean it only became Christ after we received it? Although I had no knowledge of Christ, yet because I already knew God, and knew God was no human being, I decided the Eucharist was God, and that I provided Christ's humanity. Thus, put together, me and God, this is what made the Eucharist Christ. Although I certainly never thought this made me Christ, I couldn't figure Christ out yet, I definitely experienced the Eucharist as the presence of God, which, for me, was enough. Even later, after Christ had been revealed, my initial understanding of the Eucharist never appreciably changed.